such person was not really a Muslim. Okay, how do you know? I mean, the fact that they spoke from within the Islamic tradition is sufficient. So there is the Islam of Rumi, and there is the Islam of Ibn Taymiyyah, and there is the Islam of Ibn Sina. All of them equally legitimate and equally relevant. And to me, when you ask me about Islam, then I'll give you the Islam of Abou El Fadl, which has been influenced by the Islam of Ibn Taymiyyah, the Islam of Rumi, and the Islam of Ibn Sina. Because I really do not know any other Islam. I mean, I can pretend to know another Islam, but you don't. You are thoroughly an expression of your own experience.
So you've studied Islamic law in sort of a religious context and in a sort of secular Western UCLA context. How do the two? Do you see a conflict between the two? Do they inform each other for you? You talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, not UCLA, but Princeton. Yeah, I mean, they're different animals. You experience the Islam that you grow up, or the Islamic law that you grow up learning in the way jurists are trained now. It's very. It thoroughly depends on memorization of certain texts. I have to say that I learned much more about Islamic law after my period of formal education than during my period of formal education, because the texts that you memorize are extremely limited, and and what you memorize are like horn books of Islamic law, and these horn books are thoroughly a product of a particular time and period, and their black letter laws are as misleading of a representation of Islamic law as the horn books of American law today. One of the things that you quickly learn if you go to law school, in your orientation, you'll be warned that all type of commercial publishers are going to try to sell you what are called horn books of law. Horn books of law gives you black letter rules of contract law, or black letter rules of tort law, or black letter rules of criminal law. Now, bad students, will actually buy these books and study them and take the exam relying on them. Now, and I don't know of a singular gifted student who actually used horn books and did well in law school. But horn books are created to serve mediocrity. Why? Because they distill what is a rich legal tradition to black letter meaning just positive commands. Do this, don't do this. The rule is XYZ. The same thing exists in Islamic law. I mean, the contemporary Islamic legal education focuses on memorizing these horn books produced quite often hundreds of years ago. Each, so in Azhar, you tend to there's a focus to memorize a Maliki horn book, perhaps a Hanafi horn book. Saudi Arabia, in particular, Hanbali horn book. These are different schools of thought in Islamic law. Now, the Western education, of course, pursues a very different model, and the model is that you are you master certain analytical tools which you apply to any field of inquiry that you are interested in, and you're not speaking, representing. You're not representing the will of God. You're investigating a limited question which you define for yourself. Either I want to figure out where these rules originated from, or what is the background behind these rules, or what was the impact of these rules. My view, my experience is the traditional education and the Western education not just complemented each other, but were critically they completed each other. The traditional education allowed me to a mastery of language and to a broad introduction to this very rich but static picture. Western education gave me analytical tools that allowed me to investigate into the static picture and actually discover the dynamics of motion in this picture, the ways that this picture actually is a still frame in a continuous, extremely complex film. But what I eventually also learned is that traditional, what is known as traditional classical Islamic education, is something that had that it doesn't represent the best points of the Islamic civilization or the educational institutions of the Islamic civilization. So, if you're interested in the writings of George Maqdisi in this regard are quite significant, because what people like George Maqdisi demonstrate, and what I've discovered for myself as true, is that what made Islamic discourses historically nuanced and rich and significant is that they employed analytical methods and tools similar to the ones employed by the West today. When they reproduced when their tradition was at its height. And so, for instance, the Socratic method, or what we call the Socratic method of knowledge and study, was taken from Greeks, but employed by Muslims very extensively. And and being a student in halaqas and so on, I could still see remnants of that. So, in the Socratic method, you're supposed to not be told what the answer is, but you're supposed to be always asked the question. Have any of you seen, like, in movies about law school, American law schools? And what does this case tell you about this? Well, how about, we constantly offered questions, and a question is offered as an answer to another question. And this is supposed to, as you struggle with the questions, you learn this dynamic view of knowledge. Well, one of the things that I eventually learned is that the Socratic method is how this rich corpus of Islamic writings on theology, law, philosophy, Sufism developed. And as a student of madrasas today, while the Socratic method, this analytical, exploratory method, has been largely forgotten, but still the Sheikh will often the Sheikh no longer remembers why he does it, but he will often instead of just doing a flat out lecture, giving you sort of the black letter law, the judge will ask, will solicit or responses through a series of questions. So say, and what is the rule about this, and okay, so, and what is the exception to this, and when it took me through the vehicle of Western education is how I discovered that actually that this is the leftover of the Socratic method after centuries of in which the method is forgotten and which brings us to a rather critical point, is that I've increasingly grown convinced that when it comes to epistemology, the science of knowledge, how do you know what you know? The knowledge of knowledge. That whether you look at it in a Christian context, a Jewish context, a secular context, Islamic context, you'll find what the universals are far more common than what is parochial and particular. Is it really surprising? I mean, we all have human brains, and human brains. I mean, I don't know any human who sees through their ears, right? I mean, we're all wired similarly. And so is it really surprising that it turns out that we all tend to learn in similar ways? And of course there are some cultural variation in the way we think of language and relate to language, but ultimately the way we form conceptions and the way we question things and the way we learn to empathize, or the way we learn to object, or the way we learn to be happy or be sad, it took a great deal of acculturation to get Chinese women, for instance, who that very painful practices that geishas foot binding, for foot binding to become but the interesting thing, when you start reading in memoirs of geishas and so on, which, yes, I'm one of these weird chicks who will read things like that, but they'll talk about how painful and how much they hated the process of foot binding. And it reminds me a lot of in the village when I would talk to some of the women who had I don't remember a single woman who had FGM done on her who was like who caught an infection or became ill after, who was ecstatic. I had a razor applied to my private parts, and and I became feverish and ill, and I'm so happy with it. It just doesn't happen. And it's sometimes embarrassing to think that you need to read all these books and spend 30 or 40 years of constant study at the end to realize that we are shockingly similar in the way we think and the way we it's fascinating how so many cultures end up with the same realization that lying is bad. I'm being facetious, it's not really that surprising, but and then when someone comes around and says to me that, but these people, they actually value lying. That's what education allows you to do, I guess, is that to say, this tells me much more about you than the people you are accusing of. When I read anti-Semitic texts that talked about how all Jewish people lie by their nature. And then you read texts written by Protestants about how all Catholics are traitors because their true loyalty is to the Pope and they can never be loyal to their countries, and they're constant devious liars because. And then you read, of course, Catholic texts, talk about how all the Protestants are cunning liars because they really are not true Christians. They want to dilute and escape their Christian commitments. That's why they will be bound by canon law, for God's sake. And that's why they abolish canon laws, because as proof of their lack of Christian commitment. And you constantly, in so many books, read basically people who don't like people, so they attribute to the people they don't like the worst characteristics. Whatever these characteristics are, lying, savagery, cruelty, dishonesty. You never find people who don't like people and they say, oh, they have such a bad characteristic, and that is, they're always honest. It doesn't happen. I mean, what you always find is that people agree on what are the bad characteristics are, what characteristics shame a people rather than elevate a people, that mar a people rather than honor a people. And when you constantly see these dynamics of the accusations that shame a people go along with a picture in which one group doesn't like another for whatever reason, you have to be pretty thick in the head not to get it. It just and I think that people who are not intelligent will say, and I do really come down to it, that it's an issue of intelligence. That, well, it's wrong for A to say Muslims are all liars, but it's not wrong for me as a Muslim to say that X people are all liars. I think that's a sign of lack of intelligence. Just simple. It's wrong. It's wrong all the way around. And of course, you could put, instead of lies, you could put anything else. Murderers. How many of these Islamophobic books tell you, well, Muslims, they don't really understand the worth of life very much, and that's why it's very easy for them to kill each other and kill others, and that's why it's not a big deal if you kill them, because they don't, understand the value of life the way we do. How many of these Islamophobic books tell you, well, Muslims by their nature, they actually, some of you might really want to read this. Someone who's actually at Princeton, just to some bigotry can also take a very intellectualized from a professor at Princeton who should know better but doesn't know better. Wrote a whole 2-3 books saying that Muslims have no conception of reality, and Muslims don't say the truth, not because they're liars, but because they don't understand the concept of truth. And his name is Lawrence Rosen. And believe it or not, if he was a Muslim writing this about Jewish people, I assure you, Princeton would have fired him. But it's very shameful. But the fact that he says this about Muslims, it shocks me when I see him being honored and invited and praised as a great authority in Islam and so on. I go back. Epistemology seems to be universal. The way people know and what they know, and basic ethical values at the most intuitive and innate sense are shared by human beings because their sense of pain and happiness is also shared. They and that seems to give a commonality and universalism to notions of bad and good. The fact that all human beings will feel a great deal of pain if you burn them with fire, or you cut them, or they, that seems to go a long way. And from a religious perspective, it's as a Muslim, I believe that this is just a when it's a sign of the unity of God, that God creates people in various tongues and habits and cultures, but they fundamentally reflect essential values and essential truths. And all of this knowledge, it's amazing when I think back and say, did I really need to read 20 or 30,000 books at the end to realize that we're all human beings? Yeah, because because I also read a lot of philosophy and so on. I mean, taught me a great deal about difference, and I went through a long journey of saying, no, maybe we're not, and people are very different from each other, and are these types of values, and these types of values, and these types of philosophies, and these types of philosophies, and so on. Maybe you can. So see, actually, so this is a useful trick for you, because then you don't need to read the 30,000 books.
Save you a lot of trouble.
Yeah, just accept my word. If you take my word for it, there you go.
So, I just finished a Jewish history class, and one of the points that sort of came up was, to a religious Jew, the Torah was revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, whatever the religious narrative, and then to scholars of Judaism, the position is that several authors compiled this text over a number of years, and the literature actually resembles some Babylonian literature, etc. So, those sort of how does is not limited to Muslims who are scholars of Islam, say the same thing about.
But you see, in the same, the issue is even. Let's take the secular. The secular Jews, or the secular perspective that argues that the Torah is not authored by God, and so on and so forth. There's no question that even if you are a believing Jew, and even if you believe in the fundamental divinity of the Torah, that reading that perspective might distill itself in certain critical insights about. So, for instance, you might start seeing that, although as a matter of faith you still believe in the fundamental divinity of the Torah, but you see the text as layered, as you start seeing that some parts of the text as essential to the divine message than other parts of the text, and this comes from as you read scholars who represent a view opposite to yours, you find that they point out structural realities within the text that you cannot ignore. So I think the mistake, and I understand exactly where you're coming from, but the mistake that we often fall into is that we put too much on the issue of ultimate faith or lack of. When I teach Islamic law, for instance, I'll tell you that my experience is that I get a lot of Muslim students who come and take the Islamic law course with attitude that irritates me enormously, and that is they'll take the course thinking that because they're Muslim, that they will automatically do better in the study of Islamic law than a non-Muslim. And I often start my class saying that in my experience has been that non-Muslims do, generally speaking, better than Muslims in my Islamic law course. Now, this is not because I like non-Muslims more than Muslims. Grading is anonymous and I never know who I'm grading, but because non-Muslims take the topic with a level of seriousness and anxiety that comes from lack of familiarity than Muslims. Muslims might rest on these faith-based assumptions that are problematic in terms of the pushing the envelope on knowledge. Whatever ultimate conclusions in terms of faith that you reach, I mean, one person can believe that the Quran is the literal word of God in every sense. Another person might not. But that does not mean that, by definition, the scholarship of one perspective will be superior to the other. It depends on what you do with the scholarship. And so, for instance, when it comes to, I could, still believe the Quran is divine, but say that the Quran is negotiated through human agency, and that the Quran doesn't function as a legal text in any instrumental, conclusive way. That when this like any inspirational text, it is completely contingent on human subjectivities, and then the real task is intellectually, how do you account for these human subjectivities in dealing with that text? What results from this often is something far more nuanced and far more rich than a simple exclusion of divinity. And what I mean by this is that a lot of, for instance, what we commonly called Orientalist scholarship, scholarship by non-Muslims from a particular school thought, they will look at the Quran, and their whole big issue is to argue ultimately that this verse or this chapter or this part or whatever is based, it came from the Jewish tradition, or came from the Christian tradition, or came from the Persian tradition, or came from whatever tradition. To me, ultimately, that is a far less interesting question than, regardless of where the text of the Quran came from, whether from God or from Jewish tradition or Christian tradition or whatnot, is what role that text plays after it has come. And that is a point where you actually then find that the believer and non-believer are on equal footing. The issue of belief just makes the I find, so for instance, that a lot of scholars spend a lot of time writing about how the apocryphy of the New Testament or the Old Testament and so on. To me, they're not interesting questions. What is interesting is, regardless of when a text was written and so on, what role did this text play after it came to be? And that faith or lack of has nothing to do with it. But you're of course who you studying with at Stanford, by the way?
I mean, that course was with Steven Zipperstein.
No, but the Islamic part or the Arabic part.
Oh, I mean, various.
Who?
Right now,